Everyone, excuse me, we're going to have maybe a 20-minute delay. The members just got called into a vote. We thought it would be before, but they just called it, so be shortly. Thank you.
aren't good. Subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon, everybody. I apologize for the delay. We had a series of votes, and we have one later, too, so I do want to get right to it. And I want to thank you for being here. Today, as we open today's hearing, there are an estimated 47 million people in the world living with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, more than the entire population of Spain, according to a report by the Alzheimer's Disease International. The number of victims who have Alzheimer's is projected to, or likely to, double every 20 years, so we are in a race like few other diseases because it is proliferating so fast throughout the globe. And according to Dr. Marie Bernard, the Deputy Director of the National Institute on Aging, who we will hear from momentarily, the number is estimated to grow to 115 million by 2050 as populations around the world age, although there is early onset as well, but predominantly it is one of the byproducts of all of us aging, and there seems to be a higher proclivity the older one gets, and it's been estimated that once somebody reaches 85, the chances of some form of dementia is about 1 out of 2. So it's a very, very serious problem. The total estimated global cost of addressing this condition today is $818 billion, but by as early as next year, it is estimated that this cost will rise to at least $1 trillion. That's per year, and then it will go up from there. As we all know, Alzheimer's is a cruel disease, robbing its victims of their memories and their very identities, and robbing their family and friends of the person they know and love. It is excruciatingly painful for someone to lose themselves gradually, and I have spoken myself to many individuals, especially those who are early onset, who have young families and are dealing with the agony that they know it is progressing. There is no cure. There are drugs, 5 of them so far, and others that are in the pipeline that treat symptoms, but there's no actual cure. And so it is very tough, and it takes a very heroic person to cope and manage with that. We also know that the families have to deal with a very painful ordeal as well. The caregivers, the loved ones, the family, and the friends. In 1999, along with Congressman, now Senator Ed Markey, I co-founded the Congressional Task Force on Alzheimer's Disease, which I still co-chair today with Maxine Waters, to bring this disease to the forefront of the congressional agenda, to advance support for federal research and to increase awareness. The task force worked in partnership with the Alzheimer's Association to unanimously pass the National Alzheimer's Project Act, or PL 111-375, which established an advisory committee of private and federal experts to work with the Secretary of HHS to comprehensively assess and address Alzheimer's research, institutional services, and home and community-based care with the goal to identify a cure or disease-modifying therapy for dementia by 2025. Today, there are over 170 members of the House and Senate in the task force. This year, we worked very hard in a bipartisan way to get an increase of some $414 million to the Alzheimer's research funding at NIH. Under HHS Appropriations Chairman Tom Cole's extraordinary leadership, the fiscal year 2018 Omnibus Appropriations Bill, if enacted, it was passed in September of this year, included a $400 million increase for Alzheimer's disease research at the National Institutes of Health. This would bring total funding to $1.8 billion, currently funded at $1.4 billion. NIH spending on Alzheimer's research has almost tripled since fiscal year 2015, when $589 million was allocated for such research. Shockingly, the majority of people with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia have not received a diagnosis, so they are unable to access the care and the treatment of symptoms that they so desperately need. This is true in the developed world, but it's even truer in the developing world. Michael Splain points out in his testimony today that detection and diagnosis are a stubborn problem everywhere. Research shows that most people currently living with dementia have not received a formal diagnosis, he will testify. In high-income countries, 20 to 50% of dementia cases are recognized and documented in primary care. This treatment gap, as he calls it, is certainly much greater in low and middle-income countries. Without a diagnosis, there can't be treatment, care, or organized support or the opportunity to volunteer for clinical research. Of course, even when Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia are diagnosed, care is too often fragmented, uncoordinated, and unresponsive to the needs of people living with this condition. In response, last Congress, I introduced the Health Outcomes Planning and Education, or HOPE, for Alzheimer's Act of 2015 to provide Medicare coverage for care planning session for patients newly diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, for family caregivers or legal representatives. In recognition of this great unmet need, the legislation garnered 310 bipartisan co-sponsors. Ultimately, the Medicare adopted an amended version of the HOPE, actually an improvement, for a final rule for calendar year 2017's physician's fee schedule. Of course, Alzheimer's robs its victims not only of their memories, but also of their awareness, but also their lives. In the American Journal of Public Health research survey of years of life lost versus the number of deaths between 1995 and 2015, annual deaths due to Alzheimer's complications in the U.S. alone rose from 20,607 in 1995 to 110,568 in 2015. During that period, Alzheimer's rose from the 14th leading cause of death among ailments in this country in 1995 to number 6 in 2015. For the record, this is my 4th hearing I've chaired on Alzheimer's disease. On June 23rd, in 2011, we held a hearing on the global strategy to combat the devastating health and economic impacts of Alzheimer's. On November 21st, we held a hearing on the G8 Dementia Summit and beyond. And then in 2014, on the actual summit report from the G8, and now today's hearing, of course. Today's hearing is intended to examine the existing and potential options for prevention and treatment of this always devastating disease. And the harrowing statistics cited earlier likely would be much worse in developing countries if they had accurate identification of Alzheimer's and records of victims and of deaths. As our hearing testimony will demonstrate, there is hope for Alzheimer's patients, their families, and friends. There is a surge, particularly for research. For example, a research team from Columbia University's Medical Center in 2013 said they had finally traced Alzheimer's to its early developmental stages, a discovery that they believed could lead to more effective treatments. In Science Translational Medicine 2 years ago, Australian researchers explained a non-invasive ultrasound technology that clears the brain of neurotoxic amyloid plaques, structures that are responsible for memory loss and a decline in cognitive function in Alzheimer's patients. By 2016, scientists at the Institute for Regenerative Medicine at the University of Zurich said they were amazed to find that their patients treated with the highest dose of an antibiotic drug experienced an almost complete clearance of the amyloid plaques that prevent brain cells from communicating, leading to irreversible memory loss and cognitive decline. Our witness today will tell us more about these and other advances, and again, the United States is walking point in the world in this, and we have 2 tremendous witnesses and experts who are doing their best and their staffs to make sure that we get there sooner rather than later. I would also just point out, for the record, this Congress, I've joined my colleagues in introducing the building the BOLD Act, which would establish centers of excellence, and it is designed to really take this to the next, to have congressional support for this effort in a more robust way. I've also reintroduced the Kim and Avantes law. It passed last year in the House. Deals with the wandering issue. We know that when Alzheimer's or autism individuals have the bracelet, they're found usually within 30 minutes. When they don't and they go wandering, it can be catastrophic, if not a cause of death from drowning and a whole host of other reasons if they are not rescued from that wandering. Next week, I will reintroduce the Global Brain Health Act to increase research on prevention and treatment of autism, hydrocephalic condition, and Alzheimer's, and other forms of dementia. This legislation, which I first introduced in 2015, would encourage the building of treatment capacity for these brain disorders among caregivers in developing countries and support increased international cooperation in research and implementation of strategies on prevention and treatment. I'd like to now yield to Dr. Bera for any opening comments you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. It obviously is incredibly important. Anytime you can say neurotoxic amyloid plaques in Congress, that's a good day, particularly as a physician. So I'm trained in internal medicine and taking care of many Alzheimer's patients, and the urgency of addressing this issue and looking for ways to mitigate the disease, but also ultimately looking at ways to reverse and cure disease are obviously our ultimate goals. I think we often focus here domestically on what we need to do to help address this issue, but I work pretty closely with our Alzheimer's Association, and I think the Alzheimer's Association's done a wonderful job elevating the level of dialogue, but also elevating the dialogue on why this is a global epidemic. Often when we think about global health, we're thinking about the communicable diseases that are out there, but there really is, as there are more developed nations around the world, we've got to spend more time thinking about the impact of non-communicable diseases like Alzheimer's disease. As we start to think about those public health approaches, from my public health background, there's a number of things that are the low-hanging fruit, the lifestyle modifications, the things that you can do to certainly slow down and mitigate disease. A second step is building the public health infrastructure in the global community to help both families and patients manage and navigate that disease. And again, I do think we're going to see this coming tidal wave as people live longer in the global community. The lack of infrastructure and the lack of readiness to manage this tidal wave of folks with dementia and with Alzheimer's disease and other non-communicable diseases for that matter. And then long term, this is a global challenge, and I look forward to hearing from the witnesses. We can quantify the direct costs of Alzheimer's, but then also the indirect costs of Alzheimer's in terms of both the patient as well as the impact on families and caregivers. And then ultimately, part of the reason why I am such a strong advocate for making the investments in the NIH and making investments in research is the return on that investment, if we are able to find a cure or even better therapies to mitigate disease and slow down disease, is going to be pretty significant. Because if we don't, we will be spending billions upon billions of dollars on the back end. And this is not just a U.S. challenge. This is a global challenge. So, Mr. Chairman, I think this is an incredibly timely topic. I look forward to hearing from the panelists. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Bera. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Donovan for any comments he might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for conducting this very important hearing. Many of the things that this committee does deals with diseases and things people suffering from that we don't suffer from in this country. When I came to Congress 2 weeks later, at 58 years old, I had my very first baby. Her mother actually describes her as my very last baby, by the way. So all of a sudden, maternal health and infant health, prenatal care became so important to me because it was personal to me. And I always say that Aniela Rose, Catherine, she hit the birth lottery. She was born on May 19th of 2015. On the same day, tens of thousands of other children were born. Except she was born on Staten Island in New York City and has had every one of her vaccinations, every one of her well visits, and children born that same day who didn't hit that birth lottery didn't have the same advantages she did. So that's a lot of things that this committee has done that's been personal to me. I am also the only son of an Alzheimer's patient. My mother died the year before I was elected after suffering for 4 years. I was blessed. I had her till she was 89 years old. And her mother died when she was 9, so I always say I had my mother for 50 more years than she had her own mother. But I watched this woman become someone I didn't know, a woman who was always calm, who became violent. a woman who would sit and just stare even when you would speak to her because she no longer could communicate or understand what you're saying. And I learned a lot about the disease, not as much as my friend Dr. Barry, but about the proteins that grow in people's brains and how advancements that were in medicine now is finding ways to slow that protein growth down, maybe stop it altogether, maybe at some point actually have medication that could remove the proteins from people's brains that may cure the disease, is our hopes. I know that we gave the National Institute of Health in the 21st Century Cures Act billions of dollars to help the advancement of some treatments and cures for things like Alzheimer's. So I just wanted to tell my personal stories just so I could tell you how much I appreciate you being here and how important this is in a global health environment, but how personally it's touched me. So I thank you both for being here today, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Donovan. Let me introduce our distinguished witnesses, and again, thank them for their tremendous leadership, beginning with Dr. Marie Bernard, who serves as Deputy Director of the National Institute on Aging at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Bernard serves as the Principal Advisor to the NIA Director, working closely with the Director in overseeing approximately $2 billion in aging research conducted and supported annually by the Institute. Dr. Bernard co-chairs two Department of Health and Human Services Healthy People 2020 objectives, older adults, and dementias, including Alzheimer's disease. We'll then hear from Dr. Roger Glass, who I'd point out is also from New Jersey, originally from Somerville, New Jersey. He serves as the Director of the Fogarty International Center and Associate Director for International Research at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Glass has maintained field studies in India, Bangladesh, Brazil, Mexico, China, and elsewhere in the world. He has received numerous awards, including the prestigious Charles Shepard Lifetime Scientific Achievement Award presented by the Centers for Disease Control, and the Dr. Charles Merieux Award from the National Foundation for Infectious Diseases for his work on the rotavirus vaccines in the developing world. Two experts and two very much welcomed witnesses to our subcommittee. Dr.
Well, good afternoon, Chairman Smith, Representative Bera, Representative Donovan. I'm happy and honored to represent the National Institute on Aging, one of the 27 institutes and centers at the NIH. We at the NIA lead NIH's Alzheimer's disease research, and as Deputy Director, I bring my experience as an academic geriatrician. I could very much empathize with the points that were made with regards to the prevalence of this illness and the personal impact that it had on families. When I saw patients on a daily basis, it was heartbreaking to see the impact that this had on those patients and, importantly, on their family members, and to recognize that I didn't have much of my armamentarium that I could bring to the care of those individuals at that time. It's encouraging to be at NIH at this point and to see the blossoming of more and more information that's developed with global partners that will hopefully get us to the point that we will have a prevention or a cure for this illness. We have, in fact, over the decades, supported a number of international studies that have led us to a greater understanding of the illness, and I will spend what time is allocated to me to briefly highlight three of those. First, we're making significant advances in our understanding of the course of Alzheimer's disease from our health and retirement study. This is a 20-year-old national sampling of older adults in the United States, people 50 years of age and older, who have followed through to their death. And it has allowed us to see the natural course of aging as well as the natural course of the development of Alzheimer's disease. This study has recently had a new component added to it that's an international component, the Harmonized Cognitive Assessment Protocol, or HCAP. We have the hope that if we can get researchers across the globe to harmonize the way that they go about cognitive assessments, we will be able to better understand the course of the illness and to sort out the genetic, social, and environmental influences that impact Alzheimer's disease. We're supporting the deployment of HCAP in HRS, or health and retirement study-like studies, in England, Mexico, China, and India, as well as a smaller scale study in South Africa. This will provide us an unprecedented scientific opportunity. A second important need is for means to make the diagnosis of Alzheimer's earlier than the current standard, which is when a person has cognitive and functional problems. There are many promising new findings, particularly as a result of something called the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, or ADNI. ADNI is a worldwide collaboration with organizations in Europe, Japan, Australia, Taiwan, Korea, China, and Argentina. ADNI has led to the identification of biomarkers, proteins, and images of the brain that allow us to measure the onset and progression of this disease. A decade ago, the only way that you could definitively say that someone likely had Alzheimer's disease or had Alzheimer's disease was by autopsy. But now we can see in a living brain the deposition of amyloid plaque and tau tangles in an individual and follow its course before they have clinical symptoms. As we make progress of validating this and other biomarkers, we hope to translate this into useful clinical tools. Third, NIA-supported investigators are conducting prevention and treatment trials that are globally, or have a global reach. One such study, which has received quite a bit of attention, is the autosomal dominant Alzheimer's disease trial, involving the world's largest group of early onset familial Alzheimer's disease, approximately 300 extended family members in the country of Colombia, who share a rare genetic mutation that guarantees that by middle age they are going to have Alzheimer's symptoms. The trial focuses on whether an anti-amyloid drug, crenezumab, can prevent or delay the onset of cognitive decline. We're very grateful to this family and all participants in Alzheimer's disease and related trials. They are true heroes who have allowed us to learn and continue to learn about this disease. Finally, I'd say that my patients would tell me every day that they did not want to live to grow older if they did not have their cognitive capacity, because they did not want to become a burden to their families. We, with global partners, are working diligently to develop answers to their concerns. With the global rise of Alzheimer's prevalence, the situation is urgent, as you have well articulated, and we're using every possible approach to diminish the impact of this disease as rapidly as possible. Thank you for allowing me to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Bernard, for your testimony and for your insights. Dr. Glass.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Chairman Smith, Acting Ranking Member Bera, and Distinguished Member Donovan. I too had a father with Alzheimer's, and I sympathize and went through the same experience. I'm Roger Glass. I'm the director of the Fogarty International Center at the National Institutes of Health, and I'm honored to join my colleague, Dr. Bernard, here in discussing how we're confronting the global burden of Alzheimer's disease. Diseases like Alzheimer's and like flu and Ebola know no borders. People throughout the world suffer from this disease and will benefit from treatments and cures. We need to find the brightest minds everywhere to assist in this endeavor, as well as to identify populations with unique environmental or genetic risks, because the high-quality research that we do doesn't happen only in the United States, it happens elsewhere. In order to take advantage of these international situations, we need the best trained scientists with high ethical standards, with good data management capabilities, with laboratories capable of conducting the research that's absolutely essential. Fogarty International Center at NIH facilitates building these research partnerships, leading to capacity, building capacity for researchers internationally to create the next generation of scientists who will address the Alzheimer's condition. These scientists who will address these problems in the future are just being trained today. As Dr. Bernard mentioned in her remarks, NIA is supporting the study in Colombia of an extended family with a genetic mutation for familial Alzheimer's. This family is now center stage for much of our research on Alzheimer's cures and preventions. This partnership began in the early 1990s when an American investigator, Ken Kosak, then at Harvard, met a Colombian physician, Dr. Francisco Lopero. Dr. Lopero, as a young neurologist, had a patient with Alzheimer's and found that the patient's father and grandfather had Alzheimer's. And because of his curiosity as a young physician, not as a researcher, he searched out and ultimately developed a cohort of 5,000 people with this genetic problem. And it was from this conversation 6 years later of these American and Colombian investigators that they began a decade-long collaboration to look and see what they could learn about the epidemiology and genetics of Alzheimer's. This investigation has proved incredibly fruitful, beyond our wildest expectations. In the 1990s, these doctors received a grant from Fogarty to work together. By 2004 and 2007, the National Institute of Aging and Fogarty were both engaged in supporting this collaborative research. And this research involved not only following up on the cohort, but training people in laboratory methods and building capacity so that we could actually conduct quality research under the best ethical standards in the field. At the same time, it also engendered collaborations between communities that were invested. These were not patients in Colombia, these were community participants in research, a big difference. Preparing for scientists to conduct high-impact research is critical to the Fogarty agenda. And what began as a partnership between these two scientists, individual scientists, is now at the cutting edge of what's become a $100 million clinical trial, the first in the world for early prevention of the progression of Alzheimer's disease. It's a unique study that couldn't be done anywhere else, and this cohort has really an incredible finding and discovery of Dr. Lopera. He's an essential part of the research team, as is his laboratory in Colombia, in Medellin, Colombia. Colombia is not unique in this. While the topic of today's discussion is Alzheimer's disease, the Fogarty Center has also been involved in many other neurologic problems, such as the search and research on cerebral malaria, neuro-HIV, hydrocephalus in Uganda, epilepsy in Zambia, chronic psychotic disorders in Tanzania, and stroke outcomes in Zimbabwe, just to name a few. Fogarty takes science where the problems are and where the opportunities are for the most rapidly accelerating advances in research. And we also are concerned in developing true partnerships for research and advancing capacity building. Like Dr. Lopera, who's a unique investigator in a unique setting with a unique population of this familial Alzheimer's disease that's leading us to hopefully more rapid cures. From this partnership and with NIH support, we're already advancing discovery research. We're already working in basic research in Colombia in collaboration with the US. The group in Colombia are now an integral part, an essential part of the US research endeavor on Alzheimer's. And the results of this endeavor, both for the US population and for the population in Colombia and around the world, will all benefit from this activity. Fogarty is essential for building these international collaborations, and we work very closely with NIA and with other institutes at NIH to do this important international collaboration. Thank you very much.
Dr. Glass, thank you very much for your testimony and your leadership as well. Let me just ask the question with regards to imaging, which was you mentioned a moment ago, Doctor. What kind of brain imaging are we talking about? CAT scan, MRI? Obviously, that is not available in most developing world settings.
Right.
And how, since there is such a large numbers of people never get a diagnosis, about 50% or less in the United States. How quickly is this technology being advanced so more people will get a definitive word earlier on, so some of these drugs that again only deal with symptoms can be applied to mitigate those symptoms?
So what I was describing
Yes, Doctor.
as opportunities with imaging and looking at proteins are meant to be in the research setting currently, but they are being refined, and we're beginning to look at things in the blood, in the peripheral blood. We're looking at things like changes in smell. We're looking at things like the development of depression symptoms years before a person actually has dementia, as things that will help us to be more precise in making that diagnosis clinically. So it all comes together to help us. We don't quite have something that can be translated directly from the research lab that is anything better than we currently have in terms of looking for symptoms right now.
Just let me ask you, you know, you mentioned, Dr. Glass, about the Uganda and the situation with hydrocephalic condition. I've had 5 hearings on that. We have a bill that would address that need. And we actually had doctors, Dr. Benjamin Morf, who developed a non-shunt intervention to help people who have water on the brain, and it's amazingly effective, and not much by way of having to redo it. You mentioned risk factors. Obviously, genetics is a risk factor. We all know that. And one of those studies you mentioned, you know, that's a big focus. But when you talk about environmental risk factors, we know that, you know, in the area of autism, environment does play a very serious role. And NIH has chronicled that in its reports. I'm wondering if other areas of investigation are being pursued, including toxic chemicals of various kinds, Lyme disease. I chair the Lyme disease caucus as well, and it's a huge problem in my district, in my state, and in our region, grossly underreported. And there have been studies that found that people with Lyme, that dementia was one of the consequences. And I'm wondering if that's being looked at. So maybe if you could speak to the environmental side of it, if you would.
So I'll start off and say that from the environmental perspective, yes, we have a number of studies that are looking at various environmental toxins that may be contributing to problems with the development of Alzheimer's. That's particularly assisted by projects that are looking at people in the long term and looking at what has happened to them. We're also looking at education, looking at diet, looking at geographic location. All of those may contribute. I quite honestly do not know specifically about Lyme disease. We could look back and get back to you on that. But a variety of things environmentally and socially seem to be associated with differences in the frequency with which various groups have Alzheimer's disease.
Dr. Glass, do you want to?
I don't know of other risk factors for Alzheimer's, although Hispanics have an increased risk and an earlier presentation. But for other neurologic disease, we know a lot about infections like malaria and HIV and other meningitis. We know about heavy metals and exposures. We know about foods in Africa, for instance, like manioc, which has a cyanide that leads to poisoning, and alcohol, of course, and fetal alcohol. So there are other toxins, but for Alzheimer's, don't have those yet, and we could look in and provide that information for you.
I appreciate that for the record. You know, the international response has become increasingly aggressive and robust. In 2012, WHO released a document, Dementia, a Public Health Priority, and I and Greg Simpkins and others on our subcommittee met with Dr. Margaret Chen, a former WHO Director General, and you know, she had a real heart for this, as do so many others at the WHO. In 2013, the G8, now G7 without Russia, but the G8 committed to more research funding, and that's Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, United Kingdom, and of course the United States. And I'm wondering if you could tell us that plus the newest 2017 WHO action plan. PAHO has a plan, the Pan American Health Organization. People seem to be coming up with action plans, and that's all great. But how well are they being implemented? Are the other countries, for example, like we are? We're tripling our NIH funding. It's a bipartisan effort. Again, I mentioned Tom Cole, the chairman, who's doing a wonderful job. He's got a heart for this. The Alzheimer's Association never lets up in pushing this and having a great impact. You know, in my own state, Christine Hopkins is the Alzheimer's ambassador. We all have one. And she is constantly in contact with me, and I think that is a great way of advocating on behalf of patients and caregivers. Katie Macklin is the director in our area, and I was just at a march for Alzheimer's in Bradley Beach. There was over 1,000 people. So the Alzheimer's Association, who are here, and they will be submitting testimony as well, you know, are really pushing for the private sector to come up with money, augmented, of course, and leveraged by the public sector money. Are the others doing it as well? Is Japan, is Germany, the UK, the other G8, the more affluent countries coming up with the resources So synergistically, we'll see a great surge in research.
So I could certainly say that we track what's happening internationally in something that was developed jointly with Alzheimer's Association, something called the International Alzheimer's Disease Research Portfolio, that allows us to see across the globe what's going on. It currently has more than 8,000 projects representing 30 funding agencies, 11 different countries. We also work through the department in being responsive to what the World Health Organization is doing to work across the globe in Alzheimer's projects. And we are aware that various countries have developed plans as we have. So I would probably defer to my colleague, Dr. Glass, for further elaboration.
Most important risk factor for Alzheimer's is age. And we see aging of the population around the world, which is why this has become such a tremendous problem as we look forward. And I think it's because of that aging that many groups, and including the Japanese and the English, have invested in this heavily. I think as new diagnostic methods become available, so you can actually make a proper diagnosis, the importance of Alzheimer globally will be observed in each of the countries that does the surveys. And so it's with the improvement of diagnostics that don't require a dead brain that we'll be able to understand the prevalence and increasing incidence over time.
Just two final questions. Is there a best estimate, if things don't change, where we'll be by 2025 and 2050? I gave one estimate, and there's highs and lows, of course. They're all guesstimates. Do you think we will reach the goal of a disease-modifying therapy by 2025, which was the G8 push, which is the WHO push, which is our push with NAPA, the bill that we all got behind and pushed a couple of years ago? Do you think we'll get there? I mean, is there enough critical mass of resources to get us there?
I would certainly say that we're very grateful for the additional resources that have been provided. And again, as a clinician, I'm really excited because there's been the opportunity to invest broadly. Basic research that will help us to better understand what's happening mechanistically with this illness, an explosion of recognition of genes that are related to it. We went from only knowing 4 genes a little more than a decade ago to more than 24. Lots of clinical studies, 100 or so, with results coming out in the next many years that will help us to understand which direction we need to go. Enhancement of population-based studies that will help to answer some of the questions that you were asking about toxic exposures and social factors, et cetera. So I think that there's great momentum going on, and we'll have to see. Yeah.
And I would concur. I mean, we have more tools to research Alzheimer's today than we've ever had. When my dad passed away, we have imaging techniques which are extraordinary, genetic entrees to the disease, animal models for Alzheimer's that allow us to test out new drugs. And so we're in a position better today than ever before to accelerate the advance. The fact that we have so many monoclonals in clinical trials and drugs that are being tested could, if any of them, delay the progression of the disease, they will have a huge impact on the cost of care. So I think in the short run, we have clinical trials that are ongoing now. Also, the trial in Colombia, if it's successful, we will all benefit. If it fails, it'll tell us that we're barking up the wrong tree and we need to find other targets that will be more susceptible for new drugs. So either way, I think we're on a roll that we've never had before, and the opportunities are clearly before us.
As I mentioned in my opening, I'll be reintroducing the Global Health Care Act, Global Brain Health Bill next week. It deals with 3 diseases: autism, Alzheimer's, and hydrocephalic condition, referencing what you mentioned about Uganda, Dr. Glass. It concerns me that USAID, and I've had conversations with Mark Green, the new administrator, it's important that we do infectious diseases, communicable diseases, but brain health has been left to CDC and to the diplomacy area, not to the actual assistance at the country level. So my hope is that we will be able to get this bill passed and begin moving in the direction of funding those kinds of initiatives as well. Dr. Bera.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Bernard, you talked about longitudinally following older Americans and so forth. As you're building this database and looking at that database and now adding in folks from around the world as well as in that database, what kind of patterns has it been around long enough, and what types of patterns potentially are emerging?
Thank you for asking that question, because what we're seeing is, in the United States at least, that the incidence of Alzheimer's disease may be decreasing in certain segments of the population, whether that's because of better education, better blood pressure control, better nutrition, we don't know. But we're seeing other sorts of things, like we're being able to determine that if you make it to age 70 without cognitive impairment, that you still have, as a man, almost 1 out of 4 chance of developing Alzheimer's, as a woman, a 1 out of 3 chance of developing Alzheimer's disease. And we're seeing, when we compare across countries, that there seems to be a socioeconomic status relationship. You know, the higher the socioeconomic status, the longer one puts off the likelihood of developing an Alzheimer's type dementia. So there's clearly a social component to this, and we are looking forward to further disentangling that.
Do you see a pattern with level of educational attainment? So, you know, lower rates of Alzheimer's disease in folks with higher educational attainment?
It appears that that there is such a correlation, that the rate of the development of the disease, the age at which one develops the disease is, the rate is lower, the age at which you develop is older. So there seems to perhaps be some sort of protective or beneficial effect of education.
So when I used to practice medicine, I would tell my patients to do crossword puzzles every day. It wasn't just something that I was telling them to do in terms of exercising your brain and you know, going to distant memories and
Yeah, I mean, we have a number of studies where we're trying to really disentangle exactly what makes the difference, whether it's doing crossword puzzles or the brain games are out there, et cetera. We don't have definitive evidence that that's truly impactful. We do have one study, something called the ACTIVE study, that demonstrated that if you trained people in a particular component of cognition, that was beneficial for that component, like speed of processing of information or memory or things like that. But it's not clear that it truly can put off dementia. In fact, we had the Agency of Health Research and Quality and the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to look at that very carefully for us recently. And their assessment was that we are not yet at the point that we can say definitively that those things that we've recommended to patients are going to make a difference. But it certainly can't be harmful, and particularly if they're enjoying those sorts of things. So I do the same sort of thing as well.
Dr. Glass, do you want to add anything in addition to that? Again, you know, as we do, when we do medical research, we're creating this huge database and we're looking for patterns. In terms of risk stratification now, and you know, as you know, we try to come up with better diagnostic tools. What are some of the you know, outside of family history of Alzheimer's, what are some of the other risk factors that we ought to be thinking about and educating the public on, and certainly educating our physicians on as well in our workforce?
So certainly it appears that people who are likely to develop an Alzheimer's type dementia are the people who live for a longer period of time, the people who may not have as high a level of education, people who have had problems with high blood pressure and diabetes, and that's the reason some of the populations that are considered to be underrepresented populations in the United States may have a higher prevalence, as Dr. Glass alluded to. There may be some role for past significant head trauma, things of that sort, but you know. We still haven't quite seen definitively those patterns emerge out of the database. Is that? There are risk factors that we've seen. Whether they are modifiable risk factors is the question. Yeah.
Let me just add, Congressman Bera, Dr. Bera, even within the Columbia cohort, which comes from a single founder, there are genetic mutations that have been introduced over the last 200 years, so that the age of onset, the speed of progression are all idiosyncrasies, differences that we can understand by linking the genetics with the phenotype and with the progression. So we can actually learn a lot about the genetics and by plotting those individuals. So I think when we deal with the melting pot of the United States with genes that have been mixed from all over, much more difficult to do. And I think that we'll learn a lot more from this cohort and perhaps from others which have these familial modifications.
Dr. Bernard, with a family history of Alzheimer's disease, what is the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease? Can we say definitively or no?
What we can say is that if you have an ApoE4 gene or two versions of the ApoE4 gene, that you have a very high risk. We can't say there's 100% likelihood, but a very high risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. If you have an amyloid precursor protein mutation, presenilin 1 or presenilin 2, those are associated with early onset Alzheimer's disease. They tend to be autosomal dominant, meaning that very likely you're going to develop Alzheimer's disease associated with that. That's with the Colombian cohort. And then just simply a family history, yes. I mean, if you have family members who've had an Alzheimer's type dementia, you may be at greater risk as well, whether it's related to one of those other genes that we've discovered of late, or a combination of the genes, or environmental factors or social factors. It's not totally clear at this point.
In terms of risk stratification, so patient presents with a family history of Alzheimer's disease, how readily available are the genetic testing and you know, again, just to try to think about risk stratifying?
So I think that there are private entities that are available that can do the genetic testing. We certainly have a system of Alzheimer's disease centers that are set up to bring people in to participate in research programs, and some of these centers are focusing on people who have genetic risk. And I'd again put a plug in for people to be involved with such things, because we need lots of different people, a diversity of people involved in these studies to really understand how it is going to present in different groups.
And do we know, are there any prospective studies going on right now where you're taking folks with a confirmed diagnosis of Alzheimer's type dementia, taking their family members, and prospectively following those family members, looking for patterns? Are those studies ongoing?
So we have a number of studies that are looking at people who, by biomarkers, they have the changes in the brain, they may have a genetic abnormality, but they are not yet symptomatic. And we're looking at various interventions to try to make a difference in their outcomes. So to that degree, yes.
And at this stage, with what we do know, there's nothing that prevents us from educating our healthcare workforce. If someone has that family history of Alzheimer's disease, you know, they ought to look at those other mitigating factors, manage their diabetes a little bit better, you know, look at those other lifestyle changes, you know, look at alcohol consumption, and you know, again, those other mitigating factors that potentially may not prevent them from developing Alzheimer's, but may slow down the evolution of disease. Look at maintaining brain activity through, you know, whether it's, you know, brain games or crossword puzzles, or, you know, maintaining physical well-being. Those are all reasonable interventions that we can do that probably have a cost benefit, but also, you know, is that an accurate statement?
I think that's a fair statement. That National Academies and the Agency for Health Research and Quality study that I referenced, they said that we do not yet have definitive evidence, but there's encouraging, though inconclusive, evidence that controlling blood pressure in hypertensives, physical activity can make a difference, and inconclusive, but possibility for cognitive engagement. So yes, I would hope that my colleagues, your colleagues, would do all of the things that you'd mentioned, as well as encourage those patients to think about getting involved in a clinical study.
Great. I could ask 100 more questions, but I will yield back. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Donovan?
Well, now that Dr. Bera has made Dr. Glass and myself feel real comfortable about asking about family history of two people who have Alzheimer's patients as parents. No, thank you, Doc. This entire process is an education for me. And I wanted to ask about, we're talking about studies and being able to diagnose. And Dr. Bernard, I remember when they used to say you needed an autopsy to actually do a diagnosis. I remember that. Are we advancing also in how we're treating patients now with Alzheimer's as we're waiting for the studies to conclude, and how advanced have we gone? I can't believe what you said in your testimony about, I think, identifying 4 genes 10 years ago or so. Now we could identify 24. That's an incredible advancement for the person on the panel who's not a physician. So what, has our treatment gotten better as your studies have advanced and developed?
So we unfortunately do not have a true treatment. We have drugs that can slow down symptoms for a period of time, but it really doesn't change the course of the illness. So at the same time that we are vigorously looking for that prevention or a cure, we're also supporting research that's looking at being more effective at caring for the individual with Alzheimer's disease and for their caregiver. In fact, on the NIH campus just last month, there was a summit on Alzheimer's caregiving with some 500 plus researchers, advocates, people living with dementia. And it was really edifying to hear them reviewing what's there and noting that we have a lot of interventions that are effective and can be generalized. There are opportunities for further enhancements there. Some 450 recommendations came from that study, so we are sifting through that and seeing what we can do to further enhance things. But I would like to think that we are further down the road in terms of paying attention to issues of caring for individuals with Alzheimer's and for their caregivers. There's still room for further improvement.
Anything to add, Doctor? I'm sorry.
Not really.
Okay.
It would be nice that we had a cure. There's certainly cultural differences in giving care and keeping people at home versus in institutions. Definitions that people use, and we've supported research on caregivers in the Spanish language, because the way you make a clinical diagnosis based on history is linked to the terms that are used for dementia and for acceptance of disease. And I think that's an area where we're learning, but not breakthroughs as such, just in the caregiving and the quality of caregiving.
Yeah, I certainly understand that. I mean, my mother suffered for 4 years, as I said. A woman from Trinidad and a woman from Ghana treated my mother like she was their own mother for 4 years. These people became part of our family. We still have Thanksgiving with these 2 women. My mother passed 2 years ago. And the toll that it takes on people, it was almost like at some point my mother had this innocence about her. She didn't understand what was going on with her body and her mind. It was everybody around her who were suffering. So the emphasis, and Dr. Bera said it too, the recognition and focus on some of the caregivers of Alzheimer's patients, I think, is just as important as caring for the patient. When you are successful and we do develop a treatment or a cure, another one of my fears is that, as I spoke earlier about global health with maternal health and child health, or even prenatal health, is that we're not getting those things that we actually do have now here for our children to some of those developing countries, those folks who don't have the resources we have. And I suspect we might probably have the same problem after your success in finding treatments and cures for Alzheimer's, of getting whatever is developed to folks in less developed areas of our world. And do you see that as something that, I know we have to concentrate on first finding the treatment and the cure, but once we do, getting it to folks outside of our own country, I suspect the folks in our country, for the most part anyhow, this will be more readily available to them than places in other parts of our world. So as we see with immunizations for children or prenatal care for a mom, my fear is that after you're successful, we might have the same problem getting the resources to the folks who need them outside of our own country. You see that as an issue?
Let me make 2 comments. I thought it was very thoughtful about your mother. And I think part of the issue in caregiving is, how do we train caregivers to give the quality of care that your mother got from these 2 women? My father was in exactly the same situation. And that quality of care and how we train people to provide this is essential. Some of this we can learn through global collaborations. On the other part of your question, can the interventions that we develop in the United States be carried abroad? We have a whole agenda at Fogarty on implementation science, of taking what we've learned and implementing it in developing countries. We've learned, for instance, how to prevent mother-to-child transmission of HIV, but in many countries, this has not reached all the pregnancies and mothers. And if you miss a pregnancy, you'll have a child born with HIV who will need treatment for life. So in the area of implementation strategies, that's really become a priority for our research of taking what we've learned and implementing in developing countries. I think, Chairman Smith, one other thought, since you mentioned Dr. Worf, one of the values of global health research from his research is that he developed methods to treat hydrocephalus without needing to revise shunts every few years in children in a developing country, because you can't take them in for repeat surgery. So through two procedures that he's adapted that were known but mixed together, one to open the outflow of cerebral spinal fluid, the other to cauterize the choroid plexus that produces CSF, the spinal fluid. He could decrease the flow, increase the outflow, decrease the input, and so he could do a single operation without the revision. That operation is now being used in the United States to treat our children with hydrocephalus. So it's through that research done in Uganda by an outstanding American neurosurgeon, seeing the need in that country to bring that technology home to our own children. It's another benefit of, I would say, reverse technology transfer, learning from the developing world these kinds of lessons. It'll make American children survive better with hydrocephalus as well.
And since everyone mentioned a doctor, and you're the only two doctors that I know besides Dr. Bera, Tony Fauci is a friend, and I remember him saying that at one of our conferences that if you're successful finding a cure for Alzheimer's, the amount of money that we gave NIH in the 21st Century Cures Act, it will pay for itself. The amount of money we spend on treating this disease. I thank you both for your work. Besides being here today, I thank you both for your work, the people who will benefit once you're successful. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dan. Let me just conclude and ask you, if you could, the 2017 WHO Action Plan. On November 13th, we know the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation announced $100 million for Alzheimer's research. The UN itself has established a Global Dementia Observatory to collate and disseminate key dementia data from member states to support evidence-based service planning and strengthening of policies, as well as health and social care systems. Your opinion of the WHO action plan and these steps, obviously it's a whole-of-government approach for ourselves. Are you happy with it? Do you feel that this is really going to be transformational?
First of all, we were delighted to hear about the Gates contribution to Alzheimer's, and I think as Bill and Melinda Gates age, they realize that this is a risk that's before them as well. So their investment is really appreciated and shows the broadening of global interest in this endeavor. I think the fact that the UN has a global action plan is also wonderful recognition of the importance of this problem globally. And it remains to be seen how this will be rolled out. But the fact that it's there and it's recognized by so many international partners is an awakening to the importance of the burden of this disease for all of us globally.
Thank you.
And I would just support what my colleague has said. We think that this is something that needs all the best and brightest minds put towards it, and what we have observed is that as other countries are putting resources towards it, there are more and more scientists with whom we can collaborate, and that's only to the good of all.
Of course. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for being here today. If there's anything else you'd like to add before we go to panel 2?
No, thank you.
Thank you so very much. I'd like to now welcome to the witness table panel, our second panel, beginning with Dr. Mary Mittleman, who serves as research professor at the Department of Psychiatry and Rehabilitative Medicine and director at NYU Alzheimer's Disease and Related Dementias Family Support Program at NYU's School of Medicine and the Langone Health at NYU. Dr. Mittleman was principal investigator of a randomized controlled trial of the NYU caregiver intervention funded for 20 years by the National Institutes of Health, the results of which have been published widely. Dr. Mittleman has expanded her research focus to interventions that include the person with dementia as well as the caregiver. She's the founder of the Unforgettables, a chorus of people with dementia and their family members, which rehearses and gives regular concerts in New York City. We'll then hear from Dr. Richard Mohs, who is the Chief Scientific Officer for the Global Alzheimer's Platform, GAP Foundation, a patient-centered nonprofit organization devoted to enhancing the speed and quality with which new treatments for Alzheimer's disease are developed. He retired in 2015 from Eli Lilly and Company, where he held several leadership positions, including VP for Neuroscience, Early Clinical Development, and leader of the Global Alzheimer's Drug Development Team. He also serves as member of the Board of Governors for the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, a member of the Board of Directors of Cogstate Limited, based in Melbourne, Australia, and a Senior Associate Editor for Alzheimer's and Dementia, the Journal of the Alzheimer's Association. Then we'll hear from Michael Splain, who's owner and principal in Splain Consulting, a small advocacy and government affairs consulting firm with a very big impact based in Washington, D.C. Immediately prior to starting the company, he was Director of State Government Affairs and the Public Policy Division of the Alzheimer's Association, leading its grassroots network to accomplish state policy priorities, including comprehensive state Alzheimer's plans. Well known as an advocacy trainer and grassroots organizer, Mr. Splain has also been faculty for Alzheimer's Disease International University Public Policy and is active with ADI's World Health Organization Strategy Group and is now advancing its policy agenda with UN-based opportunities in New York and Geneva. Thank you all for being here, and please, Dr. Mittleman, if you would begin. Just hit the...
Is it on now? Okay, but now the time, oh, okay, thank you. I got into this field because my mother had dementia. I'm trained as a psychiatric epidemiologist, and when my mother had dementia, my family really did not cope very well. In fact, the dementia probably drove us apart rather than bringing us together. And after she died, I decided to try to figure out whether there was a way to help families like mine to cope better with the illness. And I was lucky enough to meet 4 women who were working at NYU helping caregivers as volunteers. And I saw what they were doing, and I decided to try to run a clinical trial of what they were doing. So I wrote a grant proposal to the NIMH and was funded from 1987 to 2010, ultimately, by the NIMH and the NIA, to study an intervention that was based on what these women had been doing at NYU. The intervention, which we subsequently named the NYU Caregiver Intervention, is a multi-component intervention, and it is individualized to the needs of every caregiver. It starts with a comprehensive assessment of the primary caregiver, and then there is an individual counseling session, the point of which is to help the caregiver to understand the needs, her need or his need for support from other family members, friends, and formal support. And then there are four family counseling sessions with family members that the caregiver nominates as important to him or her, and a final individual session. So there are 6 counseling sessions in a period of 4 months. But since Alzheimer's disease can last as long as 20 years in an otherwise healthy person, we thought it was important to provide ongoing support. So other parts of the intervention that provide ongoing support are recommendations that the caregiver join a support group that's run by the Alzheimer's Association or other organizations like it. And also we were available for what we named ad hoc counseling. So any caregiver or family member who participated in our study was able to call the counselor at any time for as long as they stayed in the study. And some caregivers actually stayed in the study for more than 18 years. So in that time, in the time I was funded, and because people stayed in the study for so long, I was able to demonstrate incredible benefits of this intervention compared to the usual care that people were able to get at NYU at the time. And basically, the most important component that was not available to the control group in our original randomized control trial was the family counseling. So we think the family counseling was the key and most important ingredient in this package in the multi-component intervention. So what were some of the benefits that we were able to demonstrate? We were able to show that the first thing that happened was that the primary caregiver was more satisfied with the support that he or she got from family members and friends. This then led to significantly reduced symptoms of depression, significantly reduced symptoms of stress, improved caregiver physical health, and by those changes, all through improving family support for the primary caregiver, we were able to keep the person with dementia at home on average 1.5 years longer than the people who got our usual care. So this is a really powerful intervention, and its power is through social support. More recently, we were able to show that this intervention could save huge costs to the healthcare system. In a study that we published in Health Affairs in 2014, we showed that the state of Minnesota, with a population of about 5.5 million people, could, if every caregiver got the NYU caregiver intervention, save $996 million in 15 years. That factoid, not all the other things I told you about depression and stress and physical health, but that fact was brought to the attention of the governor of the state of New York, who, because of it, allocated $75 million to family support programs, of which now I am running one. And I think, and our program is really, while we have to do what is mandated by the state, is really, the core of it is improving social support for the family caregiver. And I think that everything that we've done has been about social support. And that is something which doesn't cost necessarily a lot of money. And I think in any country that would want to learn how to, would want healthcare providers to learn how to do this intervention, it could be done at a relatively low cost. And in developing costs, often labor is cheap and pharmaceutical interventions may be very expensive. So because of our success, even before the Health Affairs article, people in other countries were interested in doing the study. We did the 3-country study in the US, the UK, and Australia, which replicated our findings of reduced depression in caregivers, even though all of the people in the study, all the patients in the study were getting donepezil, which was an approved drug for dementia. We have done a study in Israel that showed similar findings. And we did a study we are currently finishing a study in Spanish Harlem, which is showing the effects again of this intervention. So I'm here to say that there's something right now that works, that it isn't a drug and it won't cure the disease, but it can help people to live better with the disease. And I think that while we're waiting for an intervention, a pharmaceutical intervention, it is incumbent upon all societies to do the best they can to improve the quality of life of family caregivers and people with dementia. So some of the more recent interventions that I'm involved with, you mentioned the chorus, which I founded in 2011, is a very relatively inexpensive intervention. People with dementia sing with their family members. They rehearse for concerts, and they give concerts. They learn new songs, which is something nobody believed could happen. So people with dementia are learning 18 new songs for every concert, not only giving pleasure to themselves, not only finding support with other people like themselves, but giving pleasure to the community. So I think that what we can do right now is to improve social support for family caregivers and for people with dementia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mittleman. That is so encouraging, and thank you for your leadership and for providing this subcommittee with those insights. I'd like to put that article, if you would, we could find it and make it a part of the record.
Health Affairs article?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I have the list of, there's a list in the testimony of all the articles, but I'm happy to send it to you.
Great, thank you. We'll look it up and download it and put it in. Thank you. Dr. Mohs.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure, especially to follow Dr. Mittleman. Most of my career has been devoted to trying to develop new medicines for Alzheimer's disease, and I wish I could report that we'd been more successful up to now, but I can tell you what we've been trying to do and give you some thoughts about how we could maybe make that happier. But medicine alone is not the answer, and so the programs that Dr. Mittleman and people like her are developing are going to be an integral part of the management program for dementia forever, essentially. So the Global Alzheimer's Platform Foundation, for which I now work, is a not-for-profit organization, was founded by patient advocates to help speed the completion of high-quality clinical trials of potential new therapies for treating and preventing Alzheimer's disease. It's the belief of GAP's founders, primarily George and Trish Vredenberg, along with John Dwyer, that only through rapid and rigorous testing of potential new treatments will we be able to make progress in alleviating the suffering caused by Alzheimer's disease. The foundation has worked with academic investigators, government agencies, pharmaceutical companies, and other organizations similar to GAP outside the United States to develop networks of clinical trial sites that can conduct studies quickly and with high quality. GAP has found eager partners for our efforts in the European Union, where there is something called the EPAD network for the European Prodromal Alzheimer's Disease Network. In Japan has a JPAD network, Australia has an APAD network, and we have partnerships developing in other regions around the globe. Before joining GAP, I was for 14 years, as was mentioned, at Eli Lilly and Company, where I was responsible for clinical testing of several potential new medicines for Alzheimer's disease, including two that reached large global late-phase studies. Before Lilly, of course, I had an academic career in New York at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, where we also did smaller-scale studies. Both of the compounds at Lilly that reached late-phase testing were very promising scientifically. They actually did address some aspects of what is called the amyloid cascade hypothesis, but neither showed sufficient efficacy to enable a registration as actual medicines for prescription. The 4 phase 3 trials that we did, there's usually 2 phase 3 trials for each new potential medicine, included a total of 4,694 patients with mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease, and these were conducted in 31 countries simultaneously. Approximately 40% of those were seen at clinical sites in North America, 21% at sites in Western Europe, 10% at sites in Japan, 9% at sites in Mexico and South America, 8% at sites in Eastern Europe, including Russia, 7% at Asian countries outside of Japan, and 5% in South Africa and Australia. From these experiences with GAP and Lilly and a lot of years trying to develop new medicines, I'd like to share the following observations about the global burden of disease and give you some thoughts about how I think the process of medicine development might be made a little better. First of all, in all the countries where GAP and Lilly have worked, we found a high degree of interest and cooperation from clinicians, health authorities, regulators, patients, and families. It's not difficult if you go into any of these countries to find people who are concerned about Alzheimer's disease and who are eager to contribute in some way to trying to develop a treatment. It's just a matter of trying to show them what it is they can do. I would say that in spite of their limited efficacy, the currently approved medicine for Alzheimer's disease are pretty widely used globally. We were, of course, testing our therapies as add-on to standard of care, which in most countries did include the already approved medicines, even though they have limited efficacy. And what we found was that in North America, Western Europe, and Japan, over 90% of all the study patients that we found who had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease were already receiving an AD medication. But in every country where we went, it was over 70%. I don't say that this is typical of everybody in that country because there's a lot of undiagnosed people, but they are available and they're used. It was interesting, relative to Dr. Mittleman's presentation, that the primary caregivers assisting patients with AD as they navigated through the clinical trials process varied by region. That's required because these people have some impairment that every study participant has to have a caregiver or somebody who comes with them to participate in the study. In North America, Western Europe, South Africa, Australia, and Japan, it was usually primary caregivers were spouses, about 70% in all those regions, while in the other regions, Eastern Europe, other Asian countries, and Mexico, South America, the primary caregivers were much more likely to be adult children or some other neighbor or person involved with the patient. Now I move on to some issues, and I think it's clear from what we heard earlier from the first panel, we have learned a lot about Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot of opportunities, but this is a tough nut to crack scientifically. I've spent 40 years at it, and there's a lot of smart people out there working at it very hard every day, but it's proved to be hard. So I'd like to just give you a couple observations about how the system, I think, could be a little bit better. I think developing drug candidate molecules for clinical testing based on new biological findings about AD could be faster. Basically, when you find some new bit of biology, the therapeutic implications are not always obvious, and it takes somebody who knows about what a medicine has to look like to make that translation. I think policies that facilitate communication and collaboration of academic scientists with those in the biopharmaceutical industry could be helpful to enable more rapid discovery of high-quality clinical candidate molecules accompanied by the biomarkers and other kinds of technology that's necessary to do clinical testing. If you just take the history of our drugs to date, the cholinergic deficiency in Alzheimer's disease was found in 1976. The first cholinergic therapy was not approved until 20 years later, and that was a well-known area of biology. What we know about A-beta or amyloid, the structure of that protein was originally discovered in 1986. We still do not have an A-beta related therapy, although we've tried, but it's a tough nut. I think also the conduct of clinical trials could be faster. Streamlining processes of study review, contracting with sites, review by ethics committees, and site certification could reduce time to completing clinical testing. It's often a bureaucratic nightmare to get these studies up and running. Granted, this is a human endeavor that will always have some human elements in it, but I think some of these are partly man-made problems. Many current clinical trials are designed for patients who are not yet demented, but have subtle clinical signs or biomarker evidence that they are at risk for AD. This is a lot of the current work that's going on either primary or secondary prevention. The problem is those people are not diagnosed in the current clinical care environment. We've heard that earlier. Such patients are not regularly identified in clinical practice and are very difficult to find for clinical trials. So if you go out to find them, the epidemiology tells me there's lots of them out there. We just can't find them readily for trials. And I think that policies that would encourage early diagnosis of at-risk patients would speed the completion of trials as well as provide direct benefit to patients. So those are my observations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for your testimony and, again, for your leadership as well. Thank you. Mr. Splain.
Good to see you. Thanks for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee today. Let's push the button. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I've been working with people with Alzheimer's and their families since 1986. Currently, I'm a consultant, and since 2011, our consultancy has served as the policy and advocacy advisor to Alzheimer's Disease International. ADI is the global umbrella for over 90 national Alzheimer's associations, including the U.S. Alzheimer's Association. Of historical note, and I'm a little bit of a historian because I've been around, this whole panel has been around. It's worth noting that the U.S. Alzheimer's Association and ADI share common founders. In fact, 4 years after the Alzheimer's Association was established by Jerome Stone and others, they established Alzheimer's Disease International. So some sense of this being a global issue was there even in the very beginning in the early 1980s. Our current work with Alzheimer's Disease International has put my associate Kate Gordon and myself in the middle of a burst of international energy and work streams that are moving on the issue of dementia and moving it closer to a public health priority that experts believe it needs to be. My plan with limited time is to hit the high points on what I think are key developments that have not been covered by other witnesses. The facts are stark, and in the introduction to the hearing, Mr. Smith kindly cited the facts that I have on record as well. One possible fact that was not cited by the chairman that might be of special interest to this subcommittee is the publication of a report on Alzheimer's disease in sub-Saharan Africa that is less than 6 weeks old. It was published by ADI. It estimates that there are 2.13 million persons with dementia in that region, a number that is expected to roughly double every 20 years. Sometimes there's a belief that Alzheimer's can't and dementia issues can't really be truly global, but with the publication of that report and the facts therein, I think that has been put to bed. Well, let me review some key global developments. First of all, and there's a graphic in my testimony that kind of tries to demonstrate this, dementia is increasingly understood to be a life course disease by policymakers, not merely a disease of older persons, not merely a condition of complete and utter disability, although the public perception that a person with Alzheimer's disease must necessarily be older and quite disabled in the latter stages of the disease persists. This opportunity to get diagnosed early and having early stage persons involved in the work of, in many facets of the work, is putting a different face on what it means to live with dementia. Even further to the left in that curve that you have in your packet is a representation of what the Lancet Commission and others have recently found, that there is action to be taken by public health authorities on modifiable risk factors for dementia. Keep in mind that population health, personal results may vary. We're talking about the health of the entire population. But it's pretty clear, it can be summarized as simply as what's good for your heart's good for your brain is actionable today by public health authorities. And in fact, there are many examples of that going on around the world. A second important trend or a second important global development, we continue to have detection and diagnosis as a stubborn problem everywhere. Although cited earlier, let me just repeat what you cited earlier, which is this, that without diagnosis, there can't be treatment, care, and organized support, or the opportunity to participate in research. I think some of our gap in research is the diagnostic gap, and I think this gap should also be of interest to any health system, as persons with impaired thinking and another chronic disease are expensive because thinking is important to navigating complex health decisions and treatment regimens that are only frequently seen in deep crisis. Third, I want to mention, in fact, already mentioned before the committee, that in the Americas in 2015, PAHO OPS adopted a regional dementia action plan, and in 2017, just a few months ago, the World Health Assembly adopted a global dementia aging plan. Taking a rights-based approach, these action plans call on and will provide technical support for national government plans and policies over the next 5 years to take advantage of our newer understandings of dementia and to plan, nation by nation, a response across the spectrum of the disease. I note that 30 countries have published national plans and nearly 100 subnational governments, states or regional governments, have taken action. But I will also note that in our view, only one country has taken serious action on dementia without a strong civil society push. It's almost as if we have a three-legged stool here where the advocacy as well as the knowledge of the issues and advocacy capacity are important to move forward. On rights, another subject of great interest to this committee, let me note that persons with Alzheimer's disease are in some cases using the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities as a platform for action on care and support. Dementia has been a special issue in the Organization for American States Regional Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, now out for ratification, and in a regional declaration on older persons' rights by the African Union. It has also been, dementia and its consequences has also been a major topic in the ongoing work of the UN Open-Ended Working Group on the Rights of Older Persons. Last, and I'll leave the rest of my written testimony, a broader community of interest in dementia as a social issue is emerging. It's taking many forms, such as the organizing of nearly 20,000 young professionals in Indonesia around the issue of Alzheimer's who don't have family experience, as well as issues being an agenda item at the World Economic Forum in Davos, or this week at the Salzburg Global Seminar. Also, in the wake of the Japanese tsunamis, we saw for the first time disaster authorities paying attention to the problem of Alzheimer's disease. Multiple international organizations helped raise awareness during Alzheimer's Awareness Month, and even Pope Francis made a major address on World Alzheimer Day last fall. It's fair to mention that myriad scientific meetings and cooperation are increasingly becoming the norm. The world's largest scientific meeting on Alzheimer's disease is hosted and will be hosted in our country by the Alzheimer's Association in Chicago in July. It will be followed this year immediately by the annual Conference of Alzheimer's Disease International, truly a global gathering. As I was preparing this testimony, my last thought is faces come to mind. Faces of families such as my Bergreen sisters, my Aunt Lee, my Aunt Marilyn, all Alzheimer's caregivers, my mother-in-law, but also faces of people like Lucian and D.Y. and Lee Yuf, and even two women from Yemen who started an Alzheimer's Association, its fate unknown at this moment in Yemen. I also had to think about researchers in Poland and the Czech Republic, all over Eastern Europe that I've met and enjoyed their company. There truly is a global, there's a global view in my head. I also can't not mention that I'm here today principally because 13 and a half years ago, my brother gave me a kidney. So thank you again, Dan. I'm done.
Splain, thank you very much. Thank you to your brother. Let me just, a couple of questions. Again, you are leaders. You have made all the difference in the world. And I think your point, Mr. Splain, about the importance of advocacy. When people have a message that is well-founded, and they back it up with empirical data, it gets action on Capitol Hill. As dysfunctional as people think Congress is these days, we are getting some very important things done. And I mentioned earlier a tripling of the NIH funding for Alzheimer's, and I do believe we will get to there with the 2018 HHS appropriations bill, is no small achievement. I introduced the Ronald Reagan Breakthrough Act for years, and working alongside of you and others, we couldn't get even a markup. And now we're at the point where the money is actually flowing, and we're talking about a tripling. I should underscore a tripling since 2015. So that burst that you talked about needs to become a sustainable surge for the sake of the patients, the families, the caregivers, and so thank you for your advocacy, all three of you, and others who have been instrumental in making all the difference. I think we don't focus enough on how health systems could implode over the next 30 years or so. I mean, caregivers deflect a lot of those costs that would be borne, and Dr. Middleton, you know better than anyone with your work. So often it's the spouse or it's a daughter or daughter-in-law that steps up to the plate to take care of the Alzheimer's patient. And, your work, I hope, and maybe you would answer this, whether or not the WHO new agenda item, the surge that they're making, the new 7-point, which includes in its 7 points, where was it? Providing support for caremakers of those living with dementia, caregivers, and it's one of their 7 points. Hopefully, they're listening to you and the breakthrough and landmark work you've done, so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. So, yes, please. Could you put on your mic too?
I neglected to mention earlier that because we were so successful in these randomized controlled trials, of which there's been more than one, we were being asked to provide training for providers, mostly social workers, but also nurses and people in allied professions. And we were going all around the world to provide this training as far as Israel, France, Australia. Sometimes it was fun, but eventually it got to be too much. So we got a grant from the NIA to develop online training. So now people can receive training in how to provide the intervention online when they wish, only in English and in Australian at the moment, but American English and Australian. But one could easily imagine how this training, which includes videos of both role plays and real cases of family caregivers being given the counseling, could be incredibly valuable, even if people didn't do the actual NYU caregiver intervention as we developed it, to have the training and to understand how to work with families to help them to support the primary care.
Now, how hard is it that to access? I mean, can you give the web address?
At the moment, it has a cost because it was developed with an SBIR grant, okay. But it is available, and I'd be delighted to talk to you about
That'd be great.
More online or offline. But in addition to that, we encountered another issue that we thought was worth developing a solution for, which is that very often families are dispersed. And there could be a primary caregiver in Miami, Florida, and the daughter in New York, and the daughter couldn't participate in personal counseling, and felt left out of the care. So we developed a video conferencing version of our intervention, which we're doing a randomized control trial of right now. But I think of that as a potential for people who live in other countries, who have family members who live in other countries. Perhaps the adult child is living in New York and the parents are living in China, wherever. One could use video conferencing potentially in countries where, and for people who have access to the internet, to bring families together and to provide them and the primary caregiver with the kind of support that they need.
Now, is WHO accessing this?
Well,
not that I know of, but
well,
I mean,
I know a little bit about that work stream at the WHO, and I think they're not just looking at Made in America programs. Right. I mean, they are the global health organization, and there are many to the level that we accept in the United States: random clinical trial, peer-reviewed journal, evidence-based programs that were not invented in the United States. So I think the task of the very small staff working on dementia at the World Health Organization, did I say that clearly enough?
How small?
4, 6? I mean, a place where the United States government could frankly make a real difference with a couple of secondments,
yes, exactly,
of key people from the United States to either PAHO or to WHO, which is minuscule dollars compared to what kind of rich resources we have, could make a huge difference. But they are compiling and evaluating and not reinventing the wheel, but the wheel goes both ways. One of the things we get asked all the time by ADI, representing ADI, is, can you help us access evidence-based Portuguese language, Spanish language programs that were, or Chinese language programs that were invented and validated in other cultures, because that's who we're dealing with as America ages and changes demographically. So I think, you know, it's bidirectional, it's multidirectional. I also think that you mentioned health system. Let me just say that population aging is global, and it's really an opportunity from a non-communicable disease as well as an aging point of view. It may be a real opportunity for this committee to insist on or take its own top-to-bottom look at how we make investments as a government, as a people, in global health, and start to factor in not just a disease-by-disease approach, but really maybe even this whole theme of non-communicable diseases, going back again to my testimony about the linkages between risk factors, between brain health and other health. It might be a real opportunity for the committee.
I appreciate that. And the idea of seconding U.S. personnel, that's a great idea. We'll follow up with you on that one.
Thank you.
And please take a look again at our Global Brain Initiative bill, because the idea is that infectious diseases are horrifyingly prevalent in Africa. But frankly, with Bush's PEPFAR program, which is about $5 billion a year, mother-to-child transmission, ARVs, I mean, the pandemic, it's not over, but it certainly has been mitigated, and other malaria, all those diseases, are being attacked as they should be, but we leave out brain health, except for diplomacy at WHO and elsewhere. Let me ask you, you mentioned the African Union, the African countries, 2.1 million. Has the AU, the African Union, been responsive at all, as far as you know?
From a rights perspective, the African Union is one of only 2 regions in the world that actually has an explicit rights policy for older persons. And Alzheimer's has been part of that story because, unfortunately, in some pockets in Africa, people with Alzheimer's disease are perceived as witches, demonic, right. And governments like the government of Ghana literally have disrupted these witch camps that were developed as a way of stashing people that are clearly disabled from severe cognitive issues from Alzheimer's disease or other dementia. So I think that there's some visibility. They've got a lot on their plate, but I think population aging is becoming better known. There have been 2 regional meetings inside of a year of people interested in doing more about Alzheimer's disease on the African continent that have included African Union representatives. There's also, country by country, but also as a region, I hesitate to say, but I think it's one of the most active regions in organizing around non-communicable diseases by the Non-Communicable Disease Alliance and other interested parties, because that's becoming part of the reality of health in the region as well.
Just 2 final questions. Let me ask, do you believe that we are on track to, by 2025, to get a disease-modifying treatment or maybe even a cure? Are other countries like Japan and China, the UK, coming forward with sufficient monies to, particularly on the research side, to have that critical mass Manhattan Project type of focus?
There is no doubt that in the countries that have a large number of older people, particularly Japan and certainly China and Western Europe, you'll find a lot of money being devoted to Alzheimer's research. So I don't think that that is the issue. I think there's a certain amount of discouragement that comes with lack of more tangible success, but it would help if we have these existing international organizations like WHO and OECD and so forth actually make this a priority, because it gives some credibility to these national organizations that are trying to do something about this to go ahead with international cooperation and the perception that this is really a high priority globally.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, please.
Well, I think that when we are trying to find people to participate in clinical trials of new drugs, if we have psychosocial interventions as well, as we did in the 3-country study, there may be more, these trials may seem more attractive to participants.
I think that's quite true. And it's interesting that for a brain disease to not more fully recognize the interplay between psychosocial and medical interventions is a little odd. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine in cardiology that they would think that medicine without exercise and weight control is going to solve the problem. But we just have to get an understanding that all these things have to work together. And I think from a patient acceptability standpoint, the psychosocial interventions are much more tangible and immediate and provide a more immediate benefit for people who participate in these trials.
And just the final question, and I do have others that I would like to submit to you. The issue of brain imaging that we discussed in panel number 1, do you see that as a viable diagnostic tool going forward, particularly for early onset?
Well, we were involved in the development of some of those early amyloid imaging technologies when I was back in the pharmaceutical industry, and I think it has assisted a lot in getting more biologically uniform people entering into clinical trials. Its role in ordinary clinical practice in the absence of directly related therapies is much more limited, but there's been discussions about that. But it's clearly a great advance to have a brain disease where you can actually see the pathology in life. That's something we've almost never had for any brain disease in the past.
Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and thank you, members of the panel, and my apologies. I was in another committee, and we got here as quickly as I could. I did not imagine that I would have the opportunity in the Foreign Affairs Committee to discuss Alzheimer's. And so I'm delighted that that opportunity has presented itself, and I thank the chairman again. Now, having said that, I will tell you that you probably didn't imagine the direction that I'm about to go here. I think it's fair to say that a rising tide lifts all ships. I know that's a cliche. And I would ask rhetorically, because I don't want to waste your time, whether or not we do medical research well here in the United States. I think the answer is yes. Relative to the world, we do a pretty good job, right? But the next rhetorical question would be, would the designation of a particular item as a Schedule I controlled substance stymie the ability of entities, whether government or private, to research said Schedule I controlled substance as it related to medical uses? And I think the answer, and if anybody disagrees with me, you're welcome to chime in. You can interrupt. But I think the answer has to be yes. And so obviously some of you are probably miles ahead of me because I'm a lawyer, not a doctor, which means y'all are smarter. But as I look through a list of medications derived from plants, I find medications that help with blood pressure, with malaria, with pain, with dysentery, anti-tumor agents, diuretics, antifungals, sedatives, anesthetics, muscle relaxants. Watch me mispronounce chloroturinase inhibitors, right? I mean, and when you look up medical plants, you'll find a list that is literally in the hundreds. So the question that I have for members of the panel is, and I'm not arguing in the favor of any panacea or any overarching wonderful solution, but might we be well served to review in the United States our scheduling of cannabinoids, whether it's CBD oils extracted from hemp, to allow the research to be done? Because as I look for studies that relate to CBD oil and Alzheimer's specifically, I find a lot of them, and they all come from the Netherlands and Australia and Great Britain, et cetera. And we've essentially tied our own hands behind our back with what I would argue is an archaic legal structure that denies the opportunity to find potential cures or at least aiding elements by virtue of the stigmatization of a particular plant. So the question is, could we further potentially better outcomes and at least addressing symptoms if we were to free the circumstances that currently stymie the private sector and even public monies from being used to research cannabinoids?
Well, I don't know that I can give you a complete answer to that question. Couple of comments, though. You're quite correct that many current medicines were originally discovered as extracts from the natural world, from plants or someplace else. And that's been the case throughout the history of the development of medicines. My own view, and I just speak from a couple of companies that I've worked with, yeah, it would be certainly a consideration if you were talking about trying to develop a scheduled substance as a new medicine. It means you got to do other studies, allow abuse, liability, and potential harm. But you know, we used to have a saying, no side effect, no drug. So usually medicines have some unwanted effects along with the desired effects. And the important part about any medicine development program is that you fully understand both of those, so that in the end, if the judgment is that the benefits outweigh the risks, that at least that can be approved with an appropriate labeling of all the benefits and the risks. And it's the nature of a development program that it should investigate both of those things. But if your point is that it would be a way kind of negatively on a company thinking about developing something where you had this whole other side path of trying to mitigate the risk, I think the answer is probably yes.
And there's an inherent cost, right, to that legal sort of...
Sure, there's a cost, more studies, more time, more potential that you're going to find something really... I mean, you don't want to start out with a potential new medicine where you know right off the bat that it's got downsides. I mean, that's...
And there's no arguing, certainly, that there are downsides, but I think if I'm correct, and again, I'm going to let each one of the members of the panel speak to this, that CBD oil, particularly hemp extracted, you don't get high. I mean, it's not even a side effect as it's administered therapeutically, right? I mean, that's...
I think there are cannabinoid derivatives that actually do not make you high. That's
Yes, sir.
correct.
And certainly there are some that you could, right? I mean, I'm not trying to tell the one side of the story, but anyway, I open the floor to either of you fine folks to just comment on whether or not it might be easier and cheaper and more effective to study potential positives if the scheduling regime in the United States were relaxed to allow more efficient and cheaper and more ready studying.
Well, I actually think that one of the benefits of psychosocial interventions is that they have absolutely no negative side effects. So I would go in the other direction. If I were going to try to do things that were unusual, I would try to figure out what non-pharmacologic interventions could have major impact. For example, to go back to the chorus that we founded, nobody believed when I started it that people with dementia could learn new songs, and they are learning new songs. So this is a medicine that has no potential side effects. In fact, that we did a video of the original chorus, and one of the caregivers said, "Forget about pills, just give me this." Now imagine if singing could have a major impact on learning new songs, could have a major impact on neurologic function. And we don't think about those kinds of interventions.
No, I think what you're saying is brilliant, and I appreciate it, but I'm an all of the above kind of guy, and what might work well for one individual or entity might not work as well for another. But what you're doing is commendable, and I admire you. I simply submit that because one thing works doesn't mean another doesn't, and I believe we have a regulatory scheme here that's draconian at best. And
I agree with you on that, but I think that what you're talking about is thinking out of the box.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, no, again, we're not arguing, we're agreeing.
Yeah.
Mr. Splain, am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yeah, well, not a doctor, don't play one on television. So a couple of thoughts. I wonder whether it's is it Schedule 1, or are there other things that prevent this kind of imaginative thinking about experimenting with these substances? So a couple of thoughts on that. One is we do have a pretty strong not invented here ethos in the scientific community, and I think that's made a little bit more challenged because there is a prevailing theory of Alzheimer's disease in the United States and in the United States science establishment that, although respected in other countries, they're investigating along different lines. For example, Mr. Smith, I don't want to correct you, except I will. I would add the Republic of Korea to your list of very engaged countries about Alzheimer's, also from a research point of view. Their drug mechanisms of action, remember, Alzheimer's has 3 parts. It has plaques, tangles, and inflammation. They're almost completely zeroed in on inflammation. And it's something that's almost completely not ignored, but it's not a mainstream in the United States. It's attacking amyloid. So I think that's just something to think about, is the prevailing theory keeping this out of consideration rather than Schedule 1. Last, our language about Alzheimer's treatments is most unfortunate in that somewhere in the 1980s, we started talking about disease-modifying drugs and mere symptomatic treatments. And we have minimized social interventions, we have minimized the drugs we have by calling them mere symptomatic treatments. I would submit, what is insulin? A mere symptomatic treatment? Yes, but it also, what do people want when they live with a disease? I can tell you firsthand, as somebody who has lived with disease, we want treatments that allow us to get on with our lives. So I think sometimes the language and holding out for, this is why I get really uncomfortable about, will we have a cure by 2025? We have this language we've developed in Alzheimer's about symptomatic treatment versus disease-modifying treatment, and I think that, too, is a barrier to people thinking outside the box. So maybe it's those other things that are going on in the Alzheimer's scientific thinking, not so much that it's a Schedule 1 problem.
Well, let me, at the indulgence of the chair very quickly, submit that while we search for a cure, in the interim, we should also be searching for treatments, right? That it's an all of the above, not a one or the other. And And so while we hope one day to move away from fossil fuels, in the interim, we're burning oil as we develop wind and solar, right? I mean, it's getting from point A to point B. But let me ask you this, and I'm leading intentionally because I can here. Would you not agree that Schedule 1 designation inhibits research and makes that more tedious and costly for those who might be interested in engaging in it? I was actually addressing that.
I have never had any clinical candidate that I was responsible for impeded in its development by scheduling. That doesn't mean somebody else might have. And honestly, in my time in the pharmaceutical industry, most of our interactions with FDA were actually quite helpful. They were leaning forward. Now, there may be some areas that I didn't get into where there's some adjustments that need to be made, but I will tell you, they were actually quite forward-thinking in their treatment about approval processes for Alzheimer's disease. I think they knew quite well that it was a very bad disease, and were willing to work with any sponsor that came to them with any reasonable proposal about how to develop a treatment.
But if you want to work with willow bark, you don't need to get federal government permission to get the precursor. If you want to work with quinine, you don't need to, right? I mean, anyway, thank you for being here. And again, I'm not suggesting this is a panacea, just that we should get out of our own way. And thank you all for thinking outside the proverbial box. But again, to win this fight, I think it's an all of the above and open minds and look at what works and what doesn't. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. I'll just conclude, and any comments you might want to make, any questions that went unasked, please, if you could provide those answers, or just speak to it. The idea of a goal that we developed with the NAPA bill and also the G7 and the WHO Assembly isn't that it's to sharpen the mind into martial resources, as you know. That's why I've asked, are we on the right path to either achieve it or come close? And even coming close will be an achievement. I do, Dr. Mohs, you make the point that to develop truly effective ways to treat, manage, and delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease will require many studies of potential medicines, behavioral interventions, patient-assisted technologies, and combination approaches. We are doing that, right? Or are we lagging in any of those areas?
We are doing it. I think it could be, as I mentioned, I think it could be done a little faster. Mm-hmm. The scientific uncertainty is still great, and so the only way to tackle that is to accumulate knowledge as fast as you can, and that requires a lot of stuff.
Well, how many compounds are being tested?
I think the last we checked, there were about 30-something in phase 3 and in the 60 range in phase 2, and usually companies don't report earlier than that because it's so iffy back there that it's hardly worth reporting. But there's a lot, and that doesn't even take into account all the little labs and so forth around the world. But on problems like this, you need a lot of ideas, you need a lot of studies to help resolve the uncertainty about those ideas, and the communication from different laboratories to each other so that they don't repeat and follow up on unpromising areas is very important.
I want to thank you again for your leadership, for being here today and helping to inform this subcommittee, by extension, the U.S. Congress. And I thank you again. The hearing is adjourned.
Wow, I did not see that. You're right, I didn't see that coming.